lecture, we're going to focus on primitives, and you're going to learn about reference types later in the course. Now, in the category of primitives, we have strings, numbers, booleans, undefined, and null. Let's look at each of these in action. So here we have a variable called name, which is set to a string. What we have here is what we call a string literal. That's just a fancy name for a string. Now let's declare a variable and set it to a number. So let age, we set that to 30. And by the way, I'm not 30 years old, but don't tell anyone, okay? So this is what we call a number literal. Now let's declare a boolean. A boolean can be either true or false. So let is approved to be true. This is what we call a boolean literal. And we use this in situations where we want to have some logic. For example, if the order is approved, then it needs to be shipped. So the value of a boolean variable can be true or false. And by the way, note that both true and false are reserved keywords, so they cannot be variable names. Okay? Now you have seen undefined before, so I can declare another variable, first name. If we don't initialize it, by default, its value is undefined. But we can also explicitly set this to undefined. But that's not very common. In contrast, we have another keyword that is null. So let me declare another variable and set this to null. We use null in situations where we want to explicitly clear the value of a variable. For example, we may want to present the user with a list of colors. If the user has no selection, we want to set the selected color variable to null. In the future, if the user selects a color, then we're going to reassign this variable to a color like red. And then if they click red again, perhaps we want to remove the selection, so we set this back to null. So we use null in situations where we want to clear the value of a variable. So these are the examples of primitives or value types. We have strings, numbers, booleans, undefined, and null. Now in ES6, we have another primitive that is symbol, and you're going to learn about that later in the course. One thing that separates JavaScript from a lot of programming languages is that JavaScript is a dynamic language. What do I mean by dynamic? Well, we have two types of programming languages, static languages or dynamic languages. In static languages, when we declare a variable, the type of that variable is set and it cannot be changed in the future. In a dynamic language, like JavaScript, the type of a variable can change at runtime. Let's see this in code. So back in the example from the last lecture, we have declared this name variable and we have set that to a string. So the type of name is currently a string, but it can change in the future. Let's take a look. So here in the console, we can execute some JavaScript code. We have this type of operator, and with that, we can check the type of a variable. So after that, we add the name of the variable, in this case, our name variable. So note that the type of name is a string. Now, if we reassign name to a different value, like a number, and check its type, look, the type is now changed to a number. This is what we call a dynamic language. So unlike static languages, the type of these variables will be determined at runtime based on the values that we assign to them. Now let's take a look at a few more examples of the type of operator. And by the way, note that type of is another reserved keyword, so you cannot have a variable called type of. So we can clear the console by pressing Ctrl and L. So now let's take a look at type of age. It's a number. Now if we change age to a floating point number, and I know it doesn't make sense, but let's just stick to this for this example, 30.1. And then look at type of age. It's still a number. So in JavaScript, unlike other programming languages, we don't have two kinds of numbers. We don't have floating point numbers and integers. All numbers are of type number. Now let's look at the type of is approved. It's a Boolean, as I told you before. What about the first name? Let's have a look. Type of first name. It's undefined. And that's funny because the value of this variable is undefined, but its type is also undefined. What does this mean? Well, earlier I told you that we have two categories of types. We have primitives or value types and reference types. In the primitive types category, we have strings, numbers, booleans, undefined, and null. So undefined is actually a type, but is also a value. In this example, because we have set first name to undefined as a value, its type is also undefined. Okay? Now, what about selected color? Let's have a look. So type of selected color. The type of this variable is an object. What is an object? That's the topic for the next lecture. So you have seen all the primitive types in JavaScript. Now let's take a look at the reference types. In the reference types category, we have objects, arrays, and functions. In this lecture, we're going to explore objects, and you will learn about arrays and functions later in this section. So, what is an object? An object in JavaScript and other programming languages is like an object in real life. Think of a person. A person has name, age, address, and so on. These are the properties of a person. We have the same concept in JavaScript. So when we're dealing with multiple related variables, we can put these variables inside of an object. For example, here we have two variables, name and age. They're highly related. They are part of the representation of a person. So instead of declaring two variables, we can declare a person object. And then instead of referencing these two different variables, we can just reference the person object. It makes our code cleaner. So let's see how we can declare a person object. We start with let or const if we don't want to reassign the person object, and set it to an object literal. So this syntax we have here, these curly braces, is what we call an object literal. Now, between these curly braces, we add one or more key value pairs. So the keys are what we call the properties of this object. In this case, we want this person object to have two properties or two keys, name and age. So we add name here, that's the key. Then we add a colon, and after that we set the value. So mosh. Now we add a comma and add another key value pair, age 30. So now we have a person object with two properties or two key value pairs, name and age. And with that, we don't need these two variables. Now let's log person on the console. So console.log person. Save the changes. So here's our person object. Again, note the object literal syntax. So we have curly braces, and in between them we have one or more key value pairs. And these are the properties of the person object. Now, there are two ways to work with these properties. Let's say we want to change the name of this person. So we need to access the name property. There are two ways. The first way is what we call the dot notation. So we add the name of our object, in this case person, dot. Now you can see its properties. We have age and name. So we can change the value of name to John. Now we can use the dot notation to also read the value of a property. So here on line 10, instead of logging the person object, we can log its name property. Now save the changes, and in the console we get John. The other way to access a property is using bracket notation. So bracket notation. So instead of dot, we use square brackets, and we pass a string that determines the name of the target property. So single or double quotes, but single quotes are more common. The name of the target property is name. So we can change that to, let's say, Mary. Again, when reading that, we can use the dot notation or the bracket notation. If we save the changes, now we get Mary on the console. Now you might be asking, which approach is better, dot notation or bracket notation? Well, as you can see, dot notation is a bit more concise, it's shorter, so that should be your default choice. However, bracket notation has its own uses. Sometimes you don't know the name of the target property until the runtime. For example, in our user interface, the user might be selecting the name of the target property. In that case, at the time of writing code, we don't know what property we're going to access. That is going to be selected at runtime by the user. So we might have another variable somewhere else, like selection, that determines the name of the target property that the user is selecting, and that can change at runtime. With this, we can access that property using the bracket notation in a dynamic way. So we pass selection here, and we get the same result. Okay? Now, if this is confusing, don't worry. You're going to see this again in the future as you gain more experience with JavaScript. For now, just stick to the dot notation because that's cleaner and easier. Next, we're going to look at arrays. Sometimes in your applications, you might be dealing with a list of objects. For example, the list of products in a shopping cart, or the list of colors the user has selected. In situations like that, you use an array to store that list. Let me show you how. So here I'm going to declare another variable called selected colors. Note that I'm using a meaningful name. I don't have SC or some other weird name. Selected colors. Now we can initialize this and set it to an empty array. So these square brackets are what we call array literal, and they indicate an empty array. Now we can initialize this array and add a couple of items like red and blue. Let's log this on the console. So console, the log, selected colors. Save the changes. So here's our array with 2 elements. We can expand that. Note that each element has an index, and that determines the position of that element in the array. So the index of the first element is 0, and the index of the second element is 1. So if you want to access an element in an array, we use this index. Here's how. For example, let's say you want to display the first element in this array. You use the square brackets and then specify the index. Save the changes, and now we have red. Now, earlier I told you that JavaScript is a dynamic language, so the type of variables can change at runtime. The same principle applies to our arrays. So the lengths of arrays, as well as the type of objects we have in an array, are dynamic. They can change. So on line 2, we initialize this array with 2 elements, right? Now, on line 3, we can add another element to this array, so the array will expand. So let's say selected colors of 2. That means the third item in this array is going to be green. Now, let's display this array on the console. So we have an array with 3 elements. So the length is dynamic. It can change. Also, the type of objects we have in this array is dynamic. So unlike other programming languages where every item or every object in the array should have the same type, in JavaScript, we can store different types in an array. So we can make the last element a number. Save the changes. Now we have 2 strings and a number. So the objects in the array as well as the size of the array are dynamic. Now technically an array is an object. So just like the person object we defined in the last lecture, it has a bunch of key value pairs or properties that we can access using the dot notation. Let me prove that to you. So here on the console, let's look at the type of selected colors. So the type of this array is an object. So an array is an object in JavaScript. So here on line 4, we can look at the properties of this array or this object using the dot notation. Look, these are all the properties defined in arrays in JavaScript. So every time we declare an array using square brackets, that array will automatically receive these properties. We didn't explicitly define them. They're just somehow magically inherited from somewhere else. You're going to learn about that later when we talk about prototypes. Now, in this lecture, we're going to look at one of these properties, that is the length property. This property returns the number of items or elements in an array. So, save the changes. You can see we have 3 elements in this array. Now, later in the course, we have a comprehensive section about arrays. You'll learn about all kinds of operations you can perform on arrays. For now, all I want you to take away is that an array is a data structure that we use to represent a list of items. In the category of reference types, you have learned about objects and arrays. Now let's take a look at functions. Functions are one of the fundamental building blocks in JavaScript. A function is basically a set of statements that performs a task or calculates a value. Let me show you a couple of examples. So I'm going to declare a function using the function keyword. Now we need to give it a name. Let's call that greet. After that, we need to add parentheses. That's part of the syntax for declaring functions. And then curly braces. Now what we have here inside the curly braces is what we refer to as the body of this function. And this is where we add all the statements to define some kind of logic in our application. For example, the logic for this function should be to display a message on the console. So here we can add console.log hello world. Now note that here we have a statement, so we terminate it with a semicolon. But when we are declaring a function, we don't need to add semicolon at the end because we are not declaring it like a variable like this. Okay? This is a function declaration, right? So now we have a function. We can call this function like this. So we add the name of the function and parentheses again, and then semicolon to indicate that this is a statement. Save the changes. Now we have hello world on the console. But that's pretty boring. Why would we do this? Let me show you how to make this more interesting. Our functions can have inputs, and these inputs can change how the function behaves. So let's say instead of displaying hello world, we want to display the name of the person here, like hello John. So we can add a variable here in between parentheses. We refer to this variable as a parameter. So this greet function has one parameter called name, and essentially name is like a variable that is only meaningful inside of this function. So inside of this function, we can work with this name variable, but it will not be accessible outside of this function. Now name is an input to this function. So instead of displaying hello world, we can display hello, then add a plus here to concatenate 2 strings. So we can add name after. Now, when calling the greet function, we need to pass a value for the name variable or name parameter more accurately. So we can pass John here. Now we refer to this as an argument. So John is an argument to the greet function, and name is a parameter of the greet function. That's one of the things that a lot of programmers don't know. They don't know the difference between a parameter and an argument. So a parameter is what we have here at the time of declaration, but the argument is the actual value we supply for that parameter. Okay? Now let's save the changes. So we have hello John. Now we can reuse this function, but with a different input. So we can copy this line here and change John to Mary. Save the changes. Now we have 2 different messages on the console. Now a function can have multiple parameters. So here we can separate parameters using a comma. So let's add another parameter like last name. Now we can change our console.log, add a space here, and then display the last name. Now, when calling this greet function, we should pass another argument for the last name, right? But let's see what happens if we don't do this. So I'm going to save the changes. See what we got? Hello, John, undefined. Because as I told you before, the default value of variables in JavaScript is undefined. So because we did not pass a value For the last name, by default, it's undefined. So I'm going to pass another argument here. We separate them using a comma, John Smith. And we don't need the second call to the greet function. Save the changes. Now we have hello, John Smith. Now there is a cleaner way to write this code on line 3. All these concatenations are kind of ugly. They're getting in the way. Later in the course, I'll show you how to use template literals to clean up this code. For now, don't worry about it. Let's look at another example of a function. So this function we have here is performing a task. So performing a task. Its task is to display something on the console. But sometimes our functions might calculate something. So here is an example of a function that calculates a value. So again, function. Let's call this function square. This function should take a parameter. Let's call that number. Now we need to calculate the square of that number. That is number times number. Just basic math, right? Now we need to return this value to whoever is calling this function. For that, we use the return keyword. That's another reserved keyword, so you cannot have a variable called return, okay? Now, instead of calling the greet function, let's call the square function. So square, we pass 2. Now this returns a value, so we can use that value to initialize a variable. For example, we can declare another variable called number and set it to a square of 2. And then we can display that on the console. Save the changes, so we get 4. Now, in this particular example, we don't necessarily have to declare a separate variable. If all we want to do is to display the square of 2 on the console, we can exclude this variable declaration and simply pass square of 2 to console.log. So when the JavaScript engine executes this code, first it's going to call this function. It would get a value and then pass that value to console.log. Let's save the changes and look, we still get 4. Now I have a question for you. How many function calls do you think we have in this code? We have 2 function calls. Square of 2 is one function call. Let me delete this temporarily. But console.log is also another function call, right? Because here we have parentheses. So we're calling the log function, which is defined somewhere, and passing an argument. We can pass a simple string like hello, or we can pass an expression. That expression can be a call to another function like square of 2. Okay? So this is the basics of functions. Again, later in the course, we have a comprehensive section about functions. For now, all I want you to take away is that a function is a set of statements that either performs a task or calculates and returns a value. A real-world application is essentially a collection of hundreds or thousands of functions working together to provide the functionality of that application. Hi there, it's me Mosh again. You seem to be very enthusiastic about learning JavaScript, so I want to congratulate you for your determination for learning. If you want to learn more from me, I highly encourage you to enroll in my JavaScript course. You can watch this course online or offline as many times as you want at your own pace. The course comes with plenty of exercises and solutions, and you will also receive a certificate of completion by the end of watching the course. In case you're interested, the link is in the video description. Have a great day, and I hope to see you in the course.